All right, can everybody see me all right? You see my painting? So
Yeah,
great. So my next step, since I've got this green necklace, um, I'm going to use my reference photo of this still life. Let's see if I can also bring that up just a little bit, make that visible. And I actually think it would be helpful to remind us of what I'm working from. So let me also share my screen just super quick. All right, so I'm working from this photo, and what I'm going to be doing next for you is I'm going to go ahead and paint this kazoo. A lot of us have worked with metallic objects and even transparent objects already, so you have a little bit of a grasp on that. But what I'm going to be thinking about is looking at the lightest areas of my kazoo and keeping those the light areas that I need them. And what I've done is I've looked at that really bright highlight in there. It's almost white, right? But maybe not quite completely white, right? If I compare it to other things that really are white. So what I noticed is a little bit of a yellowish component to that. So I actually painted that really light yellow wash over the whole thing. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to using darker sections. I'm going to put these darker grays in there. But before I put the darkest grays in there, I'm going to want to put something that's somewhere in the middle, right? So this kind of metallic, I don't know, brassy color is kind of yellowy, kind of greenish, kind of brown. It's hard to figure out. But let's see if we can mix up something like that. It's not quite the darkest value, but we're going to build up towards it, okay? So let me stop my share, go back. Okay. So here I have put that kind of really weak yellow wash already, all right? So this is an object that I'm going to keep working on, but I don't want to paint over this really light wash everywhere because I want to keep that as the highlights, right? So I'm going to keep that really weak yellow in place for those brightest of highlights. So moving my image back over so I can see it. Okay. So I'm going to take my my yellow ochre and I'm going to add a little bit of my ultramarine blue. And of course, yellow and blue is going to give me something kind of greenish. And if I'm looking at the color of that kazoo, something like this is pretty close to that kind of medium value, right, of that kind of old brassy color. So I'm going to go ahead and use this in places of that kazoo that have a little bit of that color to them, but I'm going to, again, keep the highlights in place. So I'm going to kind of draw around them with my pointy brush. And I also know that that green necklace is overlapping the kazoo, so I want to paint around that also. And everywhere in the kazoo except, looks like the very top rim of the mouth, that's not the mouthpiece, what is that? The little opening at the top has a little bit of this coloration to it. And there's a couple of little highlights that happen in the back too, so I'm going to maybe kind of draw around those. See if I can keep those in place. One there, and another one kind of doing this here. All right, but everywhere else I'm gonna lay that kind of medium value in there. Coming back to the front end of the kazoo, what I notice is that that same color exists, but on the top of my kazoo, it's just a little bit less dark. So I put just a little more water in it, just to kind of weaken it just slightly. But again, I want to keep that little strip of highlight in place. And I'm just going to take my damp brush and run the edge along there just to soften that edge just slightly. Then I'm going to come back up to this little opening here at the top. There's a really bright highlight along the top rim of it, but on the inside of it has some dark. So let's go ahead and put this in here. By the way, the places that I'm painting around could be painted with masking fluid, right? If you don't want to bother with kind of avoiding shapes that are highlights, use your masking fluid to do that. But so I've got now just a little more of that color of the kazoo. I've kept my highlights, that little strip of highlight that I wanted, you know, to remain really bright. And this is one of those things where, you know, if I let this dry, I'm going to keep building up towards those really dark grays, and eventually it's going to look somewhat metallic, right? There's no kind of magic metallic paint that I need. It's just about color, right? It's creating the right colors, getting those dark shadows in there where you need them, and building up those steps, right? So very quickly I'm going to switch to a different object because this needs to dry before I get those darker grays in there. I don't want it to bleed out. So I'm going to switch maybe to a couple of the beads of my necklace. So the beads of my necklace are green, kind of a dark teal green. But what I've also done with those is that you might see just these little dots in place. Those are actually masking fluid, right? So beforehand, I put a little bit of this masking fluid, little dots of it in those highlighted areas, right? So when you're painting masking fluid, use a junky brush, right? Put those little dots where you need to keep them, so you're not having to paint around little tiny highlights like that. Just makes life a little bit easier. So I did that with the masking fluid. So let's go ahead and mix up the dark kind of green teal. This is my Viridian green. Places of the green beads do get darker and even a little bit more blue in places. But for my mix, what I'm going to start with is something kind of light like this, because I'm noticing maybe in the ones that are overlapping my bird picture, they get pretty light on the top in some areas, but then pretty strong color underneath. So let's see what we end up with here. I'm painting right on top of those little blobs of masking fluid. So something like that color is kind of what I'm after. And in others of them, like let's do the one just above that, which looks like it has a little bit less of that really intense teal blue, green. So maybe I'll let a little bit less of that dry in place. But then other places I'm going to add just a little bit of my ultramarine blue to it. I want it to be a little bit darker, a little bit bluer. So the one below it, it looks like it's a little more of that kind of blue. And something else that happens with this one is that because it kind of tucks down behind the kazoo, is that it also starts to become shadowed, right? So if I feel like that value is even darker in some places, I could add a little bit of my dark brown to my blue, because again, dark brown, ultramarine blue make a really, really nice black, right? You don't have to always reach for the black tube of paint. Use your dark brown and your blue together, right? So one thing I've got here is 3 beads. They're casting that shadow on my bird painting next to it. I have a little bit of variety in terms of the color and the darkness of the color, but I'm kind of popping around to different sections of the painting depending on what's dry. So if I work on these for a little bit, I could come back potentially to my kazoo and start to layer on. I might be able to do that in a minute here, but that's still a little bit wet, so let's let that dry just a little more. But here's the idea: to work with something that is, you're trying to kind of trick the eye of your viewer into thinking they're seeing these real three-dimensional things that they can lift off the painting, right? So if I finish my necklace, I'll have that cast shadow underneath the necklace. I'll have this dark shadow underneath my kazoo. Those cast shadows become really important in convincing your viewer that those, feel three-dimensional, right? They look three-dimensional. So the process of that kazoo and getting those metallic colors, getting those colors to look metallic, I should say, is all about the value shift, the color shift. That's how I did the handle of the brush, right? That's metal. Started with these lighter grays and then simply built up towards these darker ones, and then made sure I left these little strips of white paper so that I didn't paint everything. Right? I've got some of those white highlights in place. And then you step back and it's like, voila, it looks like it's shiny metal. I didn't use any metallic paint. I just used color, right? So no real magic about it. It's just about practice, okay? So this is maybe, hopefully, helpful to you in painting something that really looks three-dimensional, has a little bit of a highlight reserved with that masking fluid, and then has some cast shadow underneath it